There's a very specific American neighborhood where you can buy a whole house for less than the price of a luxury SUV. And somehow that is not automatically good news, because yes, the house is $85,000. Wonderful. Fantastic. Congratulations. You have defeated Zillow. But then you look across the street, and there's a closed factory the size of an airport terminal, a downtown that looks like it got ghosted by capitalism, and a local economy held together by hospitals, warehouses, dollar stores, and one diner that still has ashtrays in its emotional energy. People love to say, just move somewhere cheap, okay? To where? A town where the jobs left in 1987 and the main economic development strategy is maybe someone buys the old plant? That is the weird contradiction of the Midwest factory town. These places are often shockingly affordable. Not fake affordable like starter homes in Austin are only for $189,000 if you ignore the roof. I mean actual houses in the $50,000 to $180,000 range. The kind of prices that make people from California stare at the screen, like they just discovered a glitch in capitalism. But those prices are not a gift from a benevolent housing fairy. They are the receipt from decades of industrial decline. And today we're counting down 12 Midwest factory towns where the jobs vanished. The population shrank, but the housing is still dirt cheap. Not because these places are worthless. That's lazy. But because America built entire cities around factories, then acted shocked when removing the factories caused a few side effects like unemployment, empty lots, declining tax bases, and a main street where the most successful business is sometimes a vape shop with motivational signage. The Rust Belt story is not just factories closed, it is more brutal than that. For much of the 20th century, these towns were the American dream with a time clock. Steel mills, auto plants, rubber factories, machine shops, glass plants, appliance plants, foundries. You could graduate high school, walk into a plant, get union wages, buy a house, raise kids, maybe own a boat if you were emotionally irresponsible, and retire before your knees became a weather app. Then the economy changed, automation improved, trade patterns shifted, companies moved production, global competition hit. Some factories modernized and needed fewer workers. Others closed. Some towns adapted. Others got body slammed by history and then lectured about resilience by people who make PowerPoints for a living. Nationally, manufacturing employment peaked around 19.6 million jobs in 1979. By 2019, BLS said manufacturing employment was down to about 12.8 million, a loss of roughly 6.7 million jobs, or about 35% from the peak. BLS also found the 2000s were especially nasty for the Midwest, with manufacturing jobs falling almost continuously through that decade. The decade began with a loss of about 561,000 Midwest manufacturing jobs from January 2000 to the end of the 2001 recession, then shed roughly another 604,000 between late 2001 and late 2007. That is not a vibe. That is an economic asteroid. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland has described the industrial heartland as losing 1.2 million manufacturing jobs after 2000, with unemployment eventually improving but other measures of economic health still lagging. In plain English, the jobless rate can recover while the old wealth engine never comes back. That is the part people miss. A city can have jobs again, but if the new jobs pay less, come with weaker benefits, or sit in healthcare, logistics, and retail instead of high-wage factory work, the community feels different, and then housing becomes the weird leftover. Factories leave. People leave. Demand falls. Some homes are abandoned. Some are maintained beautifully by families who never left. Some sell for prices that look impossible if you live anywhere near a coast. But cheap housing does not automatically mean easy living. It means the entry price is low. The hidden costs can be repairs, schools, taxes, insurance, safety concerns, weak local wages, and the awkward fact that your beautiful $90,000 house may sit in a town where the best job is 40 minutes away. So this is not a move here and get rich list. Please do not watch this. Buy a duplex in a town you have never visited. Then blame me when the basement has water, the roof is trauma, and the tenant pays rent in installments and vibes. This is a list about the weird bargain left behind by American manufacturing decline. Cheap houses in places that once had expensive pride. Number 12, Rockford, Illinois. Rockford is the kind of city real estate headlines love right now because it checks the magic box, affordable compared with the national market, close enough to bigger metros to look practical, and still carrying a manufacturing base that has not completely vanished into a documentary montage. But let's not pretend Rockford is some untouched fairy tale. This is still a post-industrial Illinois city that has been through job losses, population stress, crime concerns, and the long emotional hangover of being described as underrated by people who do not have to live there. The grounding fact is that Rockford housing remains cheap by national standards, even after recent price growth. Zillow showed Rockford's average home value around $180,000 in early 2026, while Houseo listed a median home price around $196,000. That is not $50,000 cheap, but compared with most American metros where a shed with plumbing now costs graduate school money, it is still affordable. The lifestyle is more real than glamorous. You get older houses, parks, local institutions, manufacturing and aerospace ties, and access to Chicago without paying Chicago housing prices. The downside is that Rockford's economy still has the unevenness of a place trying to outgrow its Rust Belt reputation while still wearing the jacket. The remaining economic base is not nothing. Rockford still has manufacturing, healthcare, logistics, and proximity to bigger markets. But the town's challenge is that affordability can attract buyers. While wages and neighborhood conditions vary sharply, Rockford is not dead. It is more like a factory town trying to rebrand without deleting the factory part, which, honestly, is healthier than pretending every old industrial city can become a craft cocktail district. With trauma. Number 11, Janesville. Wisconsin. Janesville is what happens when a town loses a giant auto plant and then everyone asks, so what now? For about 15 years, the General Motors plant in Janesville was not just a workplace. It was the civic spine. At its peak, the plant employed thousands, and when it finally closed in 2008, it punched a hole in the city's identity. The Financial Times described the old GM site as a massive vacant reminder of what used to be, and noted the plant once had about 7,000 workers at its peak. That is not just a factory closure. That is a town losing one of its main organs. But Janesville is not as cheap as some places on this list anymore. Zillow had the average home value around $193,000 in 2026, and Property Focus put the median single-family home price around $155,000. That is still cheaper than many national markets, but not exactly buy with couch change. The reason Janesville is here anyway is because it is a classic example of industrial trauma. With partial recovery, the old GM closure was devastating, but the city did not become a ghost town. Its population did not collapse the way Flint or Gary did. The region still has jobs, healthcare, logistics, education, and manufacturing. But the old single-employer golden age is gone. The lifestyle is very Midwestern practical. Houses with yards, real windows, family restaurants, people who can discuss snow tires with unsettling confidence. But the downside is that nostalgia is everywhere. The old GM site is not just land. It is a memory with weeds growing through it. Janesville proves that a factory town can survive. But survival is not the same thing as getting the old life back. Number 10, Muncie. Indiana. Muncie has the energy of a town that has been studied by sociologists so many times it should legally be allowed to invoice. Academia. It was once known as Middletown in famous sociological research because it represented ordinary American life, which is both flattering and rude. Imagine being told your city is so average it became homework. Muncie's industrial base took major hits over the decades, especially as auto-related manufacturing declined. But it is Ball State University, healthcare, government, and regional services, which help keep it from becoming purely a factory closure museum. The grounding price is still low. Zillow showed Muncie's average home value around $154,000 in 2026, while Houseo listed a median home price around $147,000. A separate 2026 housing report put typical values closer to $130,000 earlier in the year. So depending on the source and property type, Muncie still lives in the actually affordable zone. The lifestyle observation is that Muncie has more going on than outsiders assume. A university town inside a factory town creates a strange but useful mix: students, healthcare workers, older neighborhoods, cheap houses, some culture, some decay, and a downtown that keeps trying like a sitcom character with a dream. The downside is that wages and opportunity do not match the fantasies some remote buyers have. When they see low home prices, a $140,000 house is wonderful if your income is stable. It is less wonderful if your local job market feels like a scavenger hunt. Muncie is not a bad deal. It is just not a cheat code. It is a place where cheap housing meets the question every Rust Belt town asks eventually: what replaces the factory when the factory becomes a memory? Number 9. Saginaw, Michigan. Saginaw is one of those Michigan cities where the past is not really past. It is part downtown, needs repairs, and still has a GM badge somewhere in the family tree. For much of the 20th century, Saginaw was part of Michigan's automaking orbit. The Wall Street Journal described Saginaw County as once being part of a prosperous auto corridor, with General Motors employees making parts for Chevrolets and Oldsmobiles. It also reported that in recent decades, factory closures cut manufacturing jobs in the county nearly in half since 2000. That is the kind of decline that does not just change employment. It changes dinner table conversations for generations. The housing is extremely cheap in places. Redfin had Saginaw's March 2026 median sale price around $85,000, while Zillow's average home value for Saginaw was around $131,000. That spread tells you something important. Neighborhood and property condition matter a lot. One cheap house might be a decent starter home. Another might be a roof with legal responsibilities. The lifestyle is very Michigan: older houses, local pride, brutal winters, strong family roots, and people who can identify a failing transmission by sound. The remaining economy leans on healthcare, education, services, government, and whatever manufacturing is still hanging on or reinventing itself. The downside is population stress, poverty, and the long-term loss of high-wage industrial employment. Saginaw is not empty, but it has the unevenness of a city where the old economic engine was downgraded, and the replacement parts never fully arrived. Saginaw is affordable because the market remembers what happened. Real estate has a memory. And in factory towns, that memory is usually wearing work boots. Number 8. Decatur, Illinois. Decatur is a town that smells like industry, agriculture, and economic complexity, which is a polite way of saying this is not where you move if your dream is boutique minimalism and emotionally expensive candles. Decatur still has major industrial and agricultural processing activity. It has long been tied to companies like ADM and Caterpillar-related manufacturing, and its identity is very much working town Illinois. But like a lot of Midwest manufacturing centers, it has had population loss, plant closures, and labor market volatility. The grounding fact is that the housing is still cheap. Zillow listed Decatur's average home value around $105,000 in 2026. Houseo had the median home price around $114,500, and Redfin showed a March 2026 median sale price around $115,000. That is real affordability. Not affordable if your parents own a vineyard. Actual affordability. The lifestyle observation is that Decatur can work for people who want a lower cost, practical town with a real industrial base. It is lakes, older neighborhoods, institutions, and a lower cost of living. But the downside is that cheap housing comes with weaker appreciation in some areas. School and neighborhood variation. and the fact that economic opportunity can feel narrow. If your skills do not match the remaining employers, Decatur is not a ghost town. It is an industrial town trying to function in an economy that no longer guarantees industrial towns a happy ending. It is the kind of place where you can buy a house for the price of a luxury pickup, but you may still spend half your time asking, okay, but what do people do here for work now? Number 7. Anderson, Indiana. Anderson is one of those towns that used to have a much louder economic heartbeat for decades. Anderson was tied to General Motors and auto parts manufacturing. Then the plants closed or shrank, jobs vanished, and the city had to figure out how to survive after losing the thing. That made middle-class life feel predictable. If you want to understand the Rust Belt, Anderson is basically a case study with a Speedway gas station. The housing remains cheap. Zillow showed Anderson's average home value around $136,000 in 2026, while Redfin put the March 2026 median sale price around $153,000. Again, that is cheap by national standards. Especially for a city within the gravitational pull of Indianapolis, the lifestyle is not glamorous, but it is practical. You get older homes, lower prices, a manageable size, and proximity to the Indianapolis metro. The remaining economic base includes healthcare, education, logistics, service work, and regional commuting. That last part matters. Anderson's future may depend less on becoming the old Anderson again and more on being connected to the broader central Indiana economy. The downside is that the city still carries the scars of deindustrialization, empty industrial land, lower incomes, and a civic identity that had to be rebuilt after the old factory promise collapsed. Anderson is affordable partly because the old boom left behind houses and the new economy did not fully replace the old paychecks. It is not a bad place. It is just a town where the past keeps asking for a meeting. Number 6. Toledo, Ohio. Toledo is having a weird moment. On one hand, it is one of the affordable Midwest cities, getting national attention from buyers priced out elsewhere. Realtor.com forecasts and housing rankings have treated Toledo like a rising affordability star. Redfin showed a March 2026 median sale price around $133,000, while Houseo had the median around $135,500. That is wildly cheap compared with the national market. On the other hand, locals are not all celebrating. The Guardian reported in 2026 that Toledo residents have struggled with rising rents, deteriorating housing conditions, investor ownership, and a median household income around $49,724, more than $30,000 below the national rate. The same reporting said Toledo rents had surged 43% since 2021, and that homelessness in Lucas County had doubled over that period. So yes, the houses are cheap, but cheap does not automatically mean easy for local residents. Toledo's factory town legacy is deep: glass, auto parts, manufacturing, shipping, and Great Lakes industry. Some of that remains. Healthcare, education, logistics, manufacturing, and port activity still matter. This is not a city with no economic base. It is a city where the old base changed and the housing market is now getting attention from outside money. The lifestyle is underrated. Lake Erie access, older neighborhoods, decent bones, cultural institutions, and the kind of housing stock that makes coastal buyers whisper, "Wait, that's the whole house." The downside is wages, property conditions, neighborhood variation, and the strange tension of being affordable to outsiders while increasingly stressful for locals. Toledo is what happens when a city gets discovered for being cheap after spending decades being told it was struggling. That is not a comeback. That is a very complicated first date. Number 5. Dayton, Ohio. Dayton is one of America's great invention cities, which makes its economic decline feel especially insulting. This place gave the world aviation history, innovation, manufacturing muscle, and then the economy said, "Cool story." Have some plant closures. Dayton's industrial base took massive hits from the decline of GM, NCR, and other manufacturing employers. But unlike some factory towns, Dayton has a bigger and more diversified regional base now, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Healthcare, universities, logistics, aerospace, and advanced manufacturing. It is not just abandoned plants and sad murals. Still, the housing stays cheap. Redfin showed Dayton's March 2026 median sale price around $130,000, while Houseo listed the median home price around $136,500. Property Focus put single-family median pricing closer to $175,000, which reminds us that different sources measure different slices of the market. But the point stands. Dayton remains affordable by national standards. The population story is also classic Rust Belt. Dayton peaked around 162,000 people in 1960 and is now roughly half that size, with biggest U.S. cities estimating it is about 48% smaller than its peak. That is not just shrinkage. That is an urban suit to sizes to big. The lifestyle is better than outsiders expect. Historic neighborhoods, good institutions, parks, arts, aviation identity, and easy regional access. The downside is that the city still has poverty, vacancy, uneven schools, and neighborhoods where the old economy clearly left before saying goodbye. Dayton is not dead. It is actually one of the more plausible comeback stories on this list. But it is still cheap because the market remembers how much left. Dayton invented flight, then watched a lot of its middle class fly to the suburbs. The irony is rude. Number 4, Akron, Ohio. Akron was once the rubber capital of the world, which is an incredible title and also sounds like something a city would say. Right before the economy starts making other plans, Goodyear, Firestone, General Tire, Buff Goodrich. Akron was built on rubber, tires, and the kind of industrial dominance that made generations of working-class stability possible. Then the tire industry changed. Production moved. Automation happened. Corporate headquarters stayed in some cases. But the old factory jobs did not remain at the old scale. Today, Akron is not just a factory town. It is healthcare, polymers, education, corporate remnants, research, and proximity to Cleveland. But the old industrial identity still hangs over the place like a vintage sign. Nobody has the heart to take down. Housing is still inexpensive. Zillow showed Akron's average home value around $141,000 in 2026, while Houseo listed a median home price around $159,000. For a city with real institutions and access to a larger metro, that is strikingly affordable. The lifestyle observation is that Akron has actual city bones. Parks, universities, hospitals, old neighborhoods, local culture, and a location that makes it more connected than some isolated factory towns. But the downside is that affordability is uneven. Some houses are cheap because they need work. Some neighborhoods are cheap because demand is weak. Some are cheap because the tax base has been through the industrial equivalent of a divorce. Akron is trying to evolve from rubber to research, healthcare, and advanced materials. That is a smart pivot. But it does not erase the loss of thousands of old-line jobs that once held up whole neighborhoods. Akron is affordable because history left a lot of houses behind and not quite enough high-wage jobs to fill them all at premium prices. Number 3, Gary. Indiana. Gary is the city people use as shorthand when they want to say industrial collapse, without doing any research, which is unfair, but also Gary did not exactly get its reputation from a misunderstanding about brunch. Gary was literally built around U.S. Steel. It was a company town, a steel city, and at its peak in 1960 it had around 178,000 people. Census QuickFacts put Gary's 2025 estimate around 67,000. While biggest U.S. cities list the peak at 178,320, that is a massive decline. A city losing that much population does not just lose people. It loses schools, shops, tax base, political weight, and the social confidence that says tomorrow will probably be better. The housing is dirt cheap. Redfin showed Gary's March 2026 median sale price around $85,500, while Zillow listed the average home value around $92,000. That is cheaper than some luxury kitchen remodels in the suburbs. But here's the trade-off. Gary has serious poverty, vacancy, reputation issues, and public service challenges. Census QuickFacts lists a 2020 to 2020 for median household income around $38,731 and a poverty rate around 33%. That is not something you hand-wave away because the house is good bones. The lifestyle observation is that Gary has assets people forget: proximity to Chicago, Lake Michigan, rail, highways, industrial land, history, and communities with deep roots. The remaining economic base includes steel that still exists in the region, logistics, transportation, healthcare, and commuting access. But Gary's challenge is enormous because the city was built for a much larger population and a much stronger tax base. Gary is the kind of place where a house can be cheap. But the city's problems are expensive, and that is the most Rust Belt sentence ever written. Number 2. Flint, Michigan. Flint is not just a factory town. Flint is practically the national monument to what happens when industrial decline, political failure, poverty, and infrastructure neglect all form a band and release the worst album you've ever heard. Flint was once one of General Motors' great power centers. It was union history, auto wealth, blue-collar pride, and middle-class muscle. Then the auto jobs disappeared in waves. The population fell hard. Then the water crisis turned Flint from a struggling city into a global symbol of government failure. The numbers are brutal. Flint peaked around 1960 with about 196,940 people, according to biggest U.S. cities. Census QuickFacts have Flint's 2020 for population estimate around 79,735, down from 100,000 for 134 in 2010 and 81,000 to 152 in 2020. That is long-term population decline stacked on top of recent shrinkage. The housing is unbelievably cheap. Redfin showed Flint's March 2026 median sale price around $50,000, and Houseo also listed the median home price around $50,000. Census QuickFacts listed the 2020 to 2024 median value of owner-occupied housing units at $53,500. Those numbers look impossible until you remember what the city has been through. The lifestyle observation is that Flint is tougher and more human than the national stereotype. There are neighborhoods, families, churches, local businesses, artists, colleges, hospitals, and people who have been surviving headlines for decades. But the downside is very real: poverty, health concerns, infrastructure, vacancy, schools, and the long-term loss of a high-wage employment base. Census QuickFacts puts Flint's 2020 to 2020 for poverty rate around 34.1% and median household income around $37,646. That is not just cheap housing, that is economic pain with a front porch. Flint is affordable because the old economic machine broke, and the replacement never matched it. A $50,000 house sounds like a miracle until you realize miracles usually do not come with lead pipes and a municipal trauma history. Number 1. Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown is the final boss of the American factory town story. If you want one place that explains the Rust Belt emotionally, economically, and spiritually, it is Youngstown. Steel made it. Steel broke it. And ever since, the city has been trying to answer the question, what is a steel town after the steel jobs leave? Youngstown's population peaked at about 170,000 in 1930. Today, it is roughly a third of that, with biggest U.S. cities estimating the city is more than 65% smaller than its peak. The 2020 census population was 60,068. That is not normal urban shrinkage. That is a city that went from industrial heavyweight to post-industrial survival mode. Housing is extremely cheap. Houseo listed Youngstown's 2026 median home price around $92,500. Other trackers put the median sale price in the low $100,000s, with Property Focus showing a median around $130,000 and another market forecast around $105,000. Different methodologies give different prices, but nobody is confusing Youngstown with Denver. The lifestyle observation is that Youngstown has more going for it than the lazy jokes suggest. It is Youngstown State University, hospitals, old neighborhoods, parks, a strong local identity, Italian food culture, and people who have heard every Rust Belt insult and can probably out-roast you anyway. The downside is that the city's tax base, population, and job market were permanently changed by steel collapse. The remaining economy leans on education, healthcare, government, services, some manufacturing, and regional logistics. But the old days of thousands of steel jobs supporting stable neighborhoods are gone. Youngstown is cheap because history hit it with a wrecking ball and then left the invoice on the porch. But here's the thing. Youngstown is not only a warning, it is also a test. If remote workers, small manufacturers, local universities, healthcare systems, and civic leaders can turn cheap housing into actual opportunity, places like Youngstown could matter again. Not as nostalgia museums, not as Rust Belt chic, as real towns where normal people can afford houses and build lives. But that only works if the jobs, services, and neighborhoods come with it. Because cheap housing without opportunity is not affordability. It is just a discount on isolation. Ending. So what do we do with these towns? The easy joke is to say they are ruined. They are not. The easy sales pitch is to say they are hidden gems. Also no, they are complicated places with cheap housing, deep history, real people, and economies that were rebuilt after the most important employer left the chat. And that is the part that gets lost in national conversations. We talk about housing affordability like it is only a supply problem in booming coastal cities. Build more apartments, loosen zoning. Stop turning every neighborhood meeting into a hostage situation. Sure, that matters. But there is another America where housing is already cheap because demand got crushed. Warehouses cost $80,000 because the jobs that once supported $180,000 lives disappeared. Where the question is not how do we make homes affordable? The question is how do we make affordable places worth staying in? That is harder, because you cannot fix a factory town by telling people to buy cheap houses if the local economy cannot support them. You need jobs, schools, healthcare, infrastructure, safety, broadband, small businesses, regional transit, clean land, actual plans for old industrial sites that do not involve waiting for a miracle company to appear with 900 jobs and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. And you also need respect, because these towns are not failed people. They are places that got caught in enormous economic shifts, then got blamed for the consequences. The people stayed, adapted, raised families, opened businesses, coached teams, fixed roofs, and kept neighborhoods alive while the national economy moved on, and occasionally returned to film ruin porn B-roll through a broken window. So yes, the housing is dirt cheap. In Youngstown, Flint, Gary, Dayton, Akron, Toledo, Anderson, Decatur, Saginaw, Muncie, Janesville, and Rockford. The prices can look unbelievable. But the real question is not would you buy a cheap house there? The real question is what would it take for these towns to become places where cheap housing is not a warning sign, but a foundation? Tell me in the comments which factory town you think has the best chance at a real comeback, and which one is still waiting for an economy that may never return. And if you are watching this from a $2,900 studio apartment in a city where the closet is described as a bonus wellness nook, just remember, somewhere in Ohio, there's a 3-bedroom house for less than your annual rent. It may need a roof, a furnace, and an exorcism, but technically, it is affordable.